welcome everyone to the first in a series of Market Minutes, kind of a new program from BEMA we're having as an offering for our membership. The goal is to explore some topics with experts that kind of impact the industry, current events, political and environmental climate stuff, so that it's all just really pertinent to you guys and very specific. Our goal is to do these, like the setup is to do 30 minutes of content. So we want to let our speaker today, Shawn, we want to let her take the time, those full 30 minutes before you guys start kind of chiming in with questions. And then we'll do 30 minutes of discussion. You'll notice that this is not really set up like a webinar. You can turn your camera on, you can communicate across, stay muted if you'd like during the 30-minute presentation at the beginning. And then we want it to be like a conversation. Be respectful, obviously, as our speaker is sharing information with you that first 30 minutes. But other than that, we want this to be engaging after that point. So no further ado, I'll do an intro for Shawn. You may recognize Shawn from, she was a speaker at convention in one of our breakouts. She's the founder of Trade Moves and the company's chief trade strategist. Her tenure in international trade spans nearly 25 years, managing global sourcing, supply, and customs issues on behalf of U.S. companies of all sizes and trade priorities for U.S. industry associations. Shawn, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. And the floor is yours. Look forward to it.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Renee. I appreciate Kerwin and Emily inviting me to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that now. I'm going to move all of you onto my other screen here. So hopefully, and I do have my colleague here, Leo Bacalon, is also on the webinar or on the call, so he can help answer questions as well, if things come into the chat and so forth. But I'll go ahead and get started. I think this is timely to have this as a kickoff for 2026. Tariffs and trade policy have really been quite the topic in 2025 and will continue in 2026. I appreciated the opportunity to speak at convention and to sort of level set on America First trade policy and where we were, what the president's goals were, what he was looking for in terms of trade and foreign policy. And so I think it's perfect timing where there's a lot that has happened and a lot that's, I think, going to happen. And so I appreciate coming and speaking to you today and look forward to our conversation. So in terms of topics, what I'd like to do is just do a quick year in review where tariffs were, what did tariff costs look like for our sector, what did tariff costs and inflation, they're not quite as high as expected, what we're hearing from economists at the present time, but I think we'll see some changes in 2026, and then talk a little bit about how exports were not exposed to retaliatory tariffs. Then I want to pivot into 2026. What are the ongoing and evolving tariff actions? We have the Supreme Court IEEPA litigation. That's a decision is forthcoming. We're going to talk about some of the other legal authorities the president has to impose tariffs, and so that slide will look familiar to some of you who were at convention. We'll talk about Section 232 expansions and investigations on first on the expansions of steel and aluminum and investigations related to robotics. I'd also like to touch on geopolitical pressures and what's happening outside of trade policy that may impact trade policy. We also have this year the USMCA trilateral review on whether the US-Mexico-Canada agreement is working and what might be some next steps. Then I want to pivot to some other industry considerations. Can we take and leverage some of these bilateral agreements that the president is negotiating? We should be planning for more tariff action and more enforcement action by CBP, and then just summarize with some key takeaways, and then we can get into some conversation. So let's jump into right where we need to be, which is a quick overview of 2025. Tariffs were volatile. They have stabilized. The U.S. average effective tariff rate was about 2% at the beginning of 2025. We are now at about 16% average effective tariff rate on all goods. We have seen the spikes, the highs and lows of tariffs being applied. Because this chart on the right-hand side is about the effective tariff rate, we came up to about a little less than 30%, but we know some tariffs were as high as 145% on goods from China, for instance. So we have seen, again, the ebb and flow, and we've normalized now at about a tariff between 15 and 20%. For those who are sourcing from Canada and Mexico, we have the opportunity for duty-free access under USMCA compliant for USMCA compliant goods, but most other tariffs have leveled at about a 15 to 20% tariff. We know that Section 232 tariffs continue to wreak havoc on our industry as we source steel and aluminum, as well as derivatives, components, and we've seen an uplift in those tariffs, and we'll talk more about that. And of course, we still have Section 301 tariffs in place that have been normalized for a long time, but they remain on goods coming from China. So all of this has affected what that effective rate is, but it has stabilized and we haven't seen too many jolts, but things may be changing going forward. I also just wanted to quickly talk about the tariff costs that we've seen imposed on imports. So we've had, that's not the way, we've had tariffs. Our value of our imports is about 1.2 billion, and that's on sort of the typical tariff codes for the movement of bakery machinery and equipment. About $1.2 billion for year to date. It's on par with what we imported in 2024 at about 1.8 billion. And the tariffs that have been imposed because of IEEPA, we estimated about 173 million, which is an effective tariff rate of about 7%. So it could be, again, because we're sourcing some goods, some machinery from Canada, but the biggest impact we've seen is on goods coming from the EU. But effective tariff rate on our sector, about 7%. Some companies may be hit with higher tariffs than others, depending on their location and their sourcing and supply strategies. But I think it's just a helpful level set to see what we've been seeing in the trade data. Interestingly, economists are talking that tariff costs and inflation are not as high as expected. There was a lot of the sky is falling, but at the same time, we've seen a couple reasons why the tariff costs have not been fully necessarily absorbed. We have the USMCA compliant goods are exempt from IEEPA tariffs, and that has represented for our sector about 25% of our imported goods from Canada and Mexico. I find that data to be a little, it might be a little off as companies continue to do post-summary corrections and apply for and show that they are USMCA compliant. But we have seen that many sectors are not paying tariffs on goods coming from Canada and Mexico. We also saw that for that period of about 72 days, over 2 months, where goods were on the water, there were in-transit exemptions. And many sectors were trying to front load and bring in as much as they could into the United States in the early part of 2025 to avoid some of those tariffs that were expected coming down. So again, tariff costs not being absorbed because of those exemptions. We've also seen announced exemptions in which the president has said, oh, if you're on Annex 2 or 3, so you may be an unavailable natural resource or critical imports like pharmaceuticals are not being hit with these IEEPA tariffs. And so reduced that tariff exposure from some sectors, including some of our customers who are food processors, who are maybe getting cocoa or spices, now have exemptions, so are not taking on some of that tariff cost. And we've also seen tariff evasion as another reason why tariff costs and inflation have not been as high. We're seeing some importers inaccurately declaring value or the content of metals. There may be some transshipment happening or misidentified country of origin. That's resulted in reduced tariff costs. But we are seeing CBP continuing to pursue these various tactics and that importers are taking to try to avoid these higher tariffs. So these are the reasons we're not seeing that tariffs are quite as high as had been originally expected. I would also say in 2025, our U.S. exports were not adversely impacted. We had expected some of our trading partners to retaliate against US tariffs, but most of them had restraint. Canada imposed some retaliatory tariffs on US goods. The EU had threatened it. Mexico never pulled the trigger to even publish a list of where they would retaliate. Brazil had indicated they might retaliate, but they didn't. China has retaliated, but really most of the world has not gone after our US goods and has provided the opportunity for our US exports to either continue or grow. So with that overview of 2025, I think it's helpful now to just jump right into 2026. And I think the biggest question from many importers is, will the IEEPA tariffs remain in place in 2026 and beyond? So we have the IEEPA reciprocal tariffs on all countries. We have specific IEEPA tariffs on goods from China, on goods from India, on goods from Brazil that are stackable. And the president has said that he feels this is his authority to use IEEPA, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to impose tariffs on our trading partners to address these serious and extraordinary threats of our trade deficit, of our borders in which immigration and drugs are coming across the border. So the president has said that this is his authority, and the Supreme Court is expected to make a decision as early as tomorrow on whether or not these IEEPA tariffs are legal. If IEEPA tariffs are found to be legal and that the president has the authority under IEEPA to impose tariffs remain in place. There should be no immediate change in any IEEPA tariff levels or actions, but we do anticipate that we will see an increased use of IEEPA to potentially replace or build on some of these sectoral actions under Section 232 to avoid some lengthy administrative procedures, and it emboldens the president to be more assertive. It also may further minimize the role of Congress. They already have sort of reduced their powers as the power of the purse by supporting the president on his IEEPA authority. We've seen some new legislation coming from Congress to try to codify some of the IEEPA tariffs into law so that we can continue to have these tariffs at rates of 10 to 15%. So it will, if the president is found to have the authority to continue to take IEEPA tariff action, it will be his go-to trade policy tool going forward, and with limited to no guardrails. Some of that may change if there's a change in the midterm elections in terms of Democrats gaining some power, but it just is an area that we'll be continuing to watch, and the president will feel emboldened. If IEEPA tariffs are found to be invalidated by the Supreme Court, there will have to a refund process will need to be confirmed. And we see some possible refund mechanisms. One is that we have existing CBP processes. So if an entry has come into the United States and is not yet liquidated, you can file a post-summary correction through your broker within 300 days of entry and prior to 15 days of liquidation. It's an existing process, it's used all the time, and it's something that could be used by importers. Another existing process is for the liquidated entries. So you've already paid the tariffs, your tariffs have been confirmed, you can file a formal protest within 180 days of liquidation. So these already exist. And CBP has created, is now requiring that any refund mechanisms that if you're going to make any refunds, whether IEEPA tariffs or you're making some changes to post-summary corrections, are done through what's called the automated commercial environment. It's CBP's portal for filing entries, and so they're requiring that this will all have to be electronic. This is in anticipation potentially of IEEPA tariffs being refunded. There's also the fact that there could be a new process altogether. The Supreme Court could remand down to the Court of International Trade to help figure out a new process to help potentially expedite or simplify any refunds. Or there could be a situation in which there's no process, that refunds may be limited only to the plaintiffs in the case. It could be that lawsuits will have to be filed with the Court of International Trade to sue the government for those refunds. So there's a lot to watch in this space. We've already seen Costco, and we've seen toy companies and tire companies already put in some of their own cases to try to preserve their rights to refunds in the future. So we'll be watching this space to see how this is implemented if indeed IEEPA tariffs are invalidated. There's a few call outs here. Know that these potential refunds will not be a rollback of tariffs. There'll be an infusion of cash coming back to importers. But the administration has already said it has a plan B to continue to apply tariffs on imports into the United States. And I'll walk through some of those legal authorities here in a moment. And if these IEEPA tariffs are found to be invalidated, this does not impact the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. It does not impact Section 301 tariffs. It would be limited to IEEPA only. And Secretary Bessent has already said, the Secretary of the Treasury has already said that he understands that refunds could take a year or so. So it's not something that's going to be immediate, because a number of different importers will be wanting to try to process those post-summary corrections and trying to get those refunds if we go through the existing process. So this is a wait and see. We can see as early as tomorrow. I bet every importer will be reading that decision as soon as possible. If it's not tomorrow, we anticipate it will happen sometime in Q1 2026 because of the fact that the Supreme Court wanted to expedite this review and provide some clarity to importers. Let's talk a little bit about the other legal authorities. This will probably be a slide that you recognize from convention. If the president already has, we've talked about IEEPA. If IEEPA goes away, he has these other trade policy tools that he can use. Section 232, like we said, on steel, aluminum, copper, and so forth. That's to protect national security. We have Section 301, which is to counter unfair trade practices and is specific to China. He can use those. We have Section 201, which is to safeguard against import surges. If there is the value or volume is just surging into the United States, we've seen this on solar panels, on washing machines that the president could use. We also have Section 122. It's never been used, but it's to address large and serious deficits. Well, as we discussed with IEEPA, IEEPA was to respond to the national emergency or extraordinary threat, including the threat and the national emergency that we have trade deficits with our trading partners. So Section 122 could potentially replace IEEPA very easily. We also have Section 338, which is to counteract discrimination against U.S. goods. The president had also outlined in his America First trade policy that the other national emergency or extraordinary threat was how trading partners have been discriminating against U.S. goods and U.S. products with their high tariffs. So again, Section 338 is another potential legal authority he could use. Now, some of these involve investigation, some of these are time limited, but the president does have other tools in his toolbox, and we'll be watching to see how he implements his Plan B going forward. Let's talk a little bit about Section 232 tariff actions. As I mentioned, in 2025, we know that we had this steel and aluminum Section 232 expanded. It expanded in product scope, so not just the flat rolled steel and the bars, but also components and derivatives, as well as the tariff level, moving from 15 or 25% up to 50% tariff on the value of non-US origin content. Then we have seen most recently, we've seen proposals to include products, various other types of products, including products imported in steel and aluminum packaging. So evaporated milk in steel and aluminum cans, or spices in steel and tins and so forth. So we're starting to see sort of a slippery slope of the product scope on Section 232 expanding. We have over 1,000 different product codes now subject to Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. The good news is Most machinery and equipment are not currently targeted. The scope has not yet hit machinery and equipment. The watchouts, though, are that the president has mandated that we have these reviews of what products should be subject to Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, and those reviews are to happen 3 times per year. So there is an opportunity for stakeholders to comment on products that they think should be subject to Section 232 tariffs. So we'll be watching this space to see how much further expanded the Section 232 scope is. I think it's also important, we've seen some guidance come out from CBP that a number of different trade lawyers and law firms are focused, are addressing and trying to give guidance to trade on what are the requirements under Section 232 for reporting on the content of steel and aluminum. And that the full entered value of the article should include all the manufacturing, the coding, the labor costs, the fabrication, the machining, and that it really has to be a fully loaded value to make sure that you're then assessed on the appropriate content and the appropriate tariff. We're also seeing the requirement that if you have composite goods, you have to delineate metal versus non-metal content, and to be able to then have the portion be for steel and aluminum. And if it's not steel and aluminum, then you'd have IEEPA tariffs applied. And then we're also seeing that there's more requests for documented evidence of if you're noting that you have any U.S. origin metal in the product. And CBP is requiring correct classifications. They are telling importers to seek as much information as they can on the cost of metal and non-metal content. And we're starting to see more enforcement activity. The one thing that has been interesting, we've seen some importers have had instances of 200% tariffs applied on their imports because they could not tell you the country of origin. They could not tell you the content. And so the worst case scenario was that the product was from Russia, which has a 200% tariff, not a 50% tariff. And the importer had to scramble to try to provide as much information to show that the product was not from Russia. That's a worst case scenario, but we're seeing this increased enforcement from CBP. I now want to pivot to where we're seeing Section 232 tariff actions on another aspect of our sector, and that's on robotics. The president has indicated that there's concern that we need to protect our robotics industry. We've seen the National Association of Manufacturers, NAM, and many other manufacturing trade associations push back on this investigation to say that we need robotics here in the United States. We don't have a robotics industry that can meet all of our needs here in the United States, so we do rely on imports. But this investigation was initiated on September 25th of last year. It targets robots and programmable computer-controlled mechanical systems and application-specific specialty metalworking equipment. And as I understand it, the robotics are the machines that we need to make much of the machinery and equipment that we sell as part of the process line. So it's important for us to have access to these imports without additional tariffs. The good news is there are no Section 232 tariffs yet applied. Where we are watching out is that typically Section 232 tariff investigations can take up to a year before any tariffs are applied. With the copper investigation, the Trump administration expedited that investigation and tariffs were applied after only 144 days. So if we look back at September 25th, that was 108 days ago, we are getting close to a potential point in which the administration can make a determination on whether to impose Section 232 tariffs on robotics as early as a month and a half from today. So we're watching this space. There has been a lot of pushback by by the manufacturing industry, but there was also a lot of pushback on steel and aluminum as well. I also just wanted to point out that the president, again, is using Section 232 to target other sectors that are considered strategically important from a national security perspective. Again, everything from copper to semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, critical minerals, even up to lumber and drones. So the president continues to use Section 232, and so we'll be watching this space closely. I now want to pivot to some of the geopolitical considerations we've seen. America First trade policy was really, when it was announced, it was really thinking about this through the lens of trade policy, economic policy alone. But now we're seeing geopolitical pressures really in international trade and tariff actions all melding together. So we've seen the U.S. blockade of the Venezuelan oil limit. Oil has limited Chinese supply. That may further spur on retaliation by China. It also has opened the door for China to see that, oh, maybe they could take some military action against Taiwan for their own interests. That could then spur on retaliation from the United States. So we're watching the space of how geopolitics is playing out and also within our hemisphere. We've also seen the U.S. has really targeted our trading partners, not just their trading and economic policy, but their domestic policy, as we've seen in Brazil, their foreign policies, putting pressure on Mexico to try to limit Chinese inputs coming in to Mexico, and asserting this need for our national security priorities, and using, again, the possibility of tariff action and other actions to help advance the president's priorities. Just yesterday, the president announced that there could be 25% tariffs imposed on countries that trade with Iran. Many countries trade with Iran, the EU, Canada, Switzerland, Japan, some of those places that we are sourcing some of our various different machinery and equipment. So could we see additional 25% tariffs imposed on these goods? We need to be thinking about our supply chains. We've also seen Mexico respond to the United States demand for pressure on China, and we've seen them increase tariffs on steel, aluminum, and other products on non-free trade agreement partners, including China. So we're seeing countries respond to what the United States wants them to do on their own foreign policy. We have tried to put pressure on the EU to impose tariffs up to 100% on China and India to pressure Russia to end the Ukraine war. The EU has pushed back, but we are seeing that continued geopolitical pressure. And then we're also seeing these countries, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the BRICS countries, and even within the Western Hemisphere, we're seeing countries starting to have the optics of opposing U.S. trade policies, and it'll be interesting just to watch this space on how countries are reacting to. Again, there wasn't a lot of pushback against the United States in 2025, but we'll be watching this space in 2026. I also now want to touch on the USMCA trilateral review. USMCA has been an important part of North American supply chains. In our sector, we see about $450 million in cross-border trade, and that's, again, just on that limited scope of equipment and machinery. It doesn't include all your components and so on and so forth, but it's highly integrated for a number of sectors, including ours. And it's mandated under the USMCA to have a trilateral review 6 years after implementation of USMCA. And so July 2026 is that 6-year period. And the question is whether USMCA benefits the parties. President Trump negotiated this agreement, and it's meant to be dynamic. By creating this trilateral review, or what we also call a sunset review, it's to see if it's working, if it's not working, what needs to be modified, and if it's not working in the way it should be, we sort of have an exit ramp to get out of the agreement. I don't believe that USMCA is in jeopardy of going away this year. I think the USMCA is an important part of U.S. trade policy, but the president is going to continue to put leverage and to put some to use leverage to bring Mexico and Canada to the table as ways to try to potentially modify the agreement. So the considerations for USMCA going forward, the business community writ large has potentially, most sectors really want to see the continuation of USMCA duty-free trade. They want to see the US, Canada, and Mexico continue to provide that duty-free access. They want minimal to no changes, including to existing rules of origin. There are some sectors that have called out that there are problems and there need to be modifications, but very few sectors have said that we need to pull away and pull out of USMCA. The US administration is looking at this from the perspective that instead of having a trilateral agreement, they are considering two bilaterals, one with Canada and one with Mexico, and not having that North American supply chain necessarily be as integrated. That, I don't know how that will be operationalized, and it's sort of a step backwards and sort of in line with the efforts to potentially deliberalize North American trade, put on more restrictions, looking at how we're sourcing components, and if having sort of a no China input clause, if you will. So the administration has taken a lot of steps to get input from industry and is preparing for these meetings that will begin in July. The one thing that I think is the real call out to me about the real benefit for USMCA is in our sector, many of our products come in duty-free. Prior to IEEPA tariffs, we're coming in MFN duty-free because they're very low tariffs on industrial goods. But because of IEEPA, USMCA has become extremely important because if you are USMCA compliant, you're not only paying any MFN tariffs that may exist, but you are avoiding that 25 or 35% tariff. And if USMCA would go away, our exports could be hit with tariffs up to 35%, given their MFN rates. So we're watching this space. I think USMCA is safe for 2026, but there are implications on how well this is working and how the president may use USMCA for continued leverage. So I know I'm coming up to about a half hour. I will wrap up here shortly. I did want to call out that we do have, as part of the American First Trade Policy and the use of these IEEPA tariffs, the president has used that leverage to negotiate and announce these bilateral agreements. One that was recently announced is the one with the EU. It is our second largest export market for US manufactured bakery machinery and equipment. And the framework is currently our goods that go into Europe pay a 1.7% tariff. That's a nuisance tariff. It's there. And under the agreement, the EU has committed to removing those tariffs altogether. That makes our equipment that much more competitive with imports from Canada, Japan, Korea, Mexico, the UK that already have agreements with the EU. It has not yet been implemented. We expect it this year, and it's just not a significant cost savings, but it would reduce our tariff costs for those goods in about $2 million. So the president is continuing to negotiate these agreements. There was sort of a rush in 2025, and U.S. exporters want to see real market access. India is one that is hopeful that could happen in the near future. The president has continued to have negotiations with other key markets, and we're watching this to see what might happen from an industrial perspective in terms of reducing tariffs on machinery and equipment. The other, I just want to call out that sort of the steps for industry to consider as we have potential new tariff action and evolving tariff action. All companies, whether you're the importer of record or you're downstream or customer, you're not the importer of record, we have been telling our clients, continue to use the current tariff levels for 2026 planning purposes. Whatever the levels are for IEEPA and for Section 232, that's what you should be using for planning purposes. But understand those supply chain vulnerabilities. If you are sourcing or if you're manufacturing in Canada, and we now see Iran in the crosshairs by the president of potential tariffs of 25% on goods from Canada, will there be a USMCA exemption? I don't know. But understanding what your supply chain vulnerabilities are based on some of these new geopolitical considerations and some of the new tariff actions the president is exploring. If you're an importer, we have been repeating over and over again to track those IEEPA tariffs that have been applied. Work with your broker to make sure that you have visibility into all the tariffs that you have paid as the importer of record. And work with your customs broker to ensure that we have the proper classification and the correct origin is claimed in anticipation that there could be tariff actions by HS code. All those sectoral Section 232 tariff actions that the president has been taking are based on tariff classification. So that'll be an important consideration if we move to Section 232 tariffs. We've just been sort of to the point of understanding your supply chain vulnerabilities, ensure there's greater visibility into your supply chains. They go hand in hand. We're seeing CBP, again, focused on tariff evasion and knowing where products are coming from. So understanding where your products are sourced from, where they're being shipped from, and what the country of origin is. And securing the documentation to the best of your ability on steel, aluminum, and so forth. Because of this increased enforcement, CBP wants to maximize revenue collection, including with Section 232 tariffs. And for those that are not the importer of record, to the extent possible, what IEEPA tariffs have been passed on by importers? How were you collecting that information, tracking it so that if IEEPA tariffs are found to be invalidated, you can have a process and a discussion with your importer, whoever was the importer who's passed on that cost, to be able to potentially negotiate a refund or figure out a mechanism if it's not already embedded in your contract. And we have also been suggesting that IEEPA tariffs be separated as a line item on invoices for that ability to be able to track what those IEEPA tariffs are. We have seen some importers not specifically calling that out and embedding it in, but to the extent it's possible, requesting that separate line item. So you may be receiving that information, that request from some of your customers as well. So key takeaways, and then I'll wrap up and we can have a discussion. This is a systematic overhaul. The America First trade policy is a systematic overhaul, not only in trade policy. It is now really about foreign policy and using tariff action as key leverage. Again, our greater than 15% is the new normal for the new average tariff. If IEEPA goes away, know that tariffs are expected to remain at the current levels. The president's just going to use different legal authorities. If IEEPA remains, the president will be more assertive. I anticipate we'll have minimal intervention by Congress. And the only way we will see potential pushback is if there's a midterm election changes. That could impact trade policy from 2027 onward. So the second 2 years of the president's second term. And then I do believe USMCA is safe for now. But I think those trade tensions will be expected to increase in advance of the USMCA trilateral review. And I just want to underscore it's critical to understand your supply chain, identify these vulnerabilities and tariff cost risks, and expect increased enforcement from CBP. They are moving from, typically CBP will provide what's called a CF-28, sort of a fact-finding type of request to get information from importers before they give what's called a CF-29, which is the notice of action to uplift tariffs. We are now seeing CBP sort of bypassing CF-28s and going right to CF-29s, so that creates less opportunity for importers to be able to respond and provide additional information. So a lot more needed from importers to make sure that they understand their supply chain and can document their imports. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that we can have a conversation if that's okay with everybody.
We haven't done this before, so there's not like a great model. If you want to come off mute and just ask your question, you're more than welcome. Like, honestly, that's preferred, or you can hit to raise your hand, but if you have questions for Shawn about this, about anything having to do with tariffs, don't hold back.
AI unverified, please go.
Yeah. Charlotte, go ahead.
Yeah, Shawn, thank you so much. That was really great. Learned a lot. I was curious, on the when you were talking about the process, the various processes that could exist for getting refunds if IEPA is determined to not be used in this way and they go away. How will we know what process to use? Will that come through the courts or will that come through an announcement from the administration, do you think?
That's a really good question. So there's a couple scenarios. The Supreme Court could, in its decision, instruct the administration to go ahead and start processing refunds within existing processes, and those two that exist for the post-summary corrections or having to file a formal protest depending on when that product liquidated. Or they could tell them to come up with a more simplified. I doubt that the Supreme Court would tell them to do a simplified process, but may instruct the administration just not to obstruct. We expect they're not going to make it easy.
Got it.
Or they could also go down to what's called the U.S. Court of International Trade and ask the Court of International Trade to provide more guidance on that refund process. So if the announcement is tomorrow, that doesn't necessarily mean we will know what that refund process looks like. And I expect there will be some additional steps that may need to be taken. But I also anticipate that folks will start potentially trying to go ahead and file those post-summary corrections as soon as possible to preserve their rights for refunds.
Got it. And then I had another question about the different options that President Trump has as his plan Bs. I was curious, and you might not be able to answer this because I'm asking you to read his mind, but you mentioned that Section 338 and 122 have never been used, but those seem to be the main reasons he often gives for using tariffs. Do we have any idea why he's choosing not to use those sections?
Well, I think there's been sort of a strategic plan in place with the administration when they did America First trade policy. I think by using IEPA, they were pushing to see if they were get pushback. And if they're not going to get pushback, or if the Supreme Court were to support the president, then you don't need to use these other authorities because some of them are time limited or some of them have limits on the amount of the tariff that can be applied. But under Section 122, it's up to, I think, 15%. Oh, Leo will remind me. I think it's 15% for 180 days. Well, that was about what the IEPA tariffs were under 2025. So there's, and then it can be, then the tariffs can be extended by congressional action. So I think there was a strategic decision to use IEPA to see if there would be pushback. And if there wasn't pushback, then we could go to these other legal authorities. But because they, again, have some restrictions, potential restrictions, it was to see how far presidential authority could be pushed. And so we'll see if they're used. I anticipate they will be.
All right. Thank you so much, Shawn.
We have another question from Alan Wright. He asked, what do you predict will happen to tariffs post the Trump presidency? Many tariffs were implemented in Trump's first term and did not go away under Biden. What do you see happening?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. Section 301, President Biden did not change, did not remove, did not modify those Section 301 tariffs, kept them there for leverage on China. China will be considered an economic adversary and have been in many ways considered a bad actor when it comes to treatment of U.S. goods, protection of intellectual property. So there was, for sure, a reason or a justification under the Biden administration to keep those there. Section 232 tariffs, really not highly modified either to protect steel and aluminum, and that industry made sense for Democrats as well as Republicans. But IEEPA tariffs, if IEEPA tariffs were to stay considered valid, I think those would be rolled back potentially under a Democratic presidency, maybe not a Republican. And as I mentioned, we are seeing efforts within Congress to try to codify these IEEPA tariffs under laws that we'd had other legal authorities. So I think this is the new normal for at least 3 years, potentially more. But it will also depend on where tariffs, how they hit in terms of inflation, how they hit consumers in the grocery carts. And right now, it is companies that are absorbing most of the tariff cost, not necessarily passing them on to the consumers, because they're trying to see where will tariffs land. And so if tariffs continue at the same levels and move forward and inflation becomes a little bit more untenable, then we may see future presidencies try to roll those back. It's all speculation, but I hope that just provides at least some context of what we'll be looking at.
Great. Kerwin, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm kind of going back to the refund thing. If that is something that happens, it seems like a lot of work. And so do you think people will go kind of towards their broker to help them out? Are there going to be a bunch of companies that pop up that says, hire me and I'll get back and I'll split it with you, or, certain percentage? Or will associations like BEMA sort of collectively help people do that? It just seems like there's 1,000 details on, like every shipment that I've had over the last year, and what part of that, and was it, detailed out or whatever. I see that as a mess. And do you see how people are we have, over 200 member companies, and a lot of them have been impacted. How are they going to go about going? And some of these are small companies. They don't have the resources. So
yeah,
any
no,
thoughts
those are
there?
great questions, Kerwin. And well, let me first say that one of the reasons we noted as one of the possible refund mechanisms is whether or not there is a more simplified procedure or something that you don't have to go through your broker, or is there, I don't know if that will be even considered or implemented, but some of the questions during the Supreme Court hearing put to the administration was the complexity of the refund process. Now, post-summary corrections it's not rocket science. It can be done. It's just going to be, the resources by these brokers to do that. And they'll be overwhelmed. I think the ACE portal will be overwhelmed. So it was a question though about how difficult of a refund process. I did not like the question, and I didn't like the response that, oh, it is so complicated. It is not complicated. It doesn't have to be complicated, and that should not be a reason not to process refunds.
Right.
If the Supreme Court does remand this down to the Court of International Trade for how this might happen, that may provide some clarity. Again, on day one, I don't think we will. No, right away. To your question about there's also a couple other things happening, and then I'll talk about there are a couple other things happening. You're seeing private equity firms and others paying cents on the dollar for those refunds, so that you get the clarity and know what you're going to get in terms of a refund, and then they'll take on that burden. And you're seeing different companies take advantage of that. And some people are going to make a lot of money. Some people just want that cash infusion back right away. They need it, and then write off the rest, right? So we're seeing that happening. Your question about whether there'll be other, not necessarily using your broker, but using other firms to assist in that. Again, you have to have that access to the ACE portal and have the ability to do that. So that may limit it unless there is a simplified process. I don't necessarily see a role for industry associations to do it collectively on behalf. I don't see that as a possible route at this, but more being part of the information sharing and guidance and finding some of those resources to share. But I don't think there's a role right now that I can see as a possibility.
Bimbo, the largest baker in the world, in the U.S. or whatever, just earlier this week said that they started litigating or suing or whatever for their refunds. So
yeah. Corinne, you broke up a little bit, but I heard you say that just pushing back with litigation to try to preserve those refunds.
Yeah, Bimbo's doing that, so we'll want to see more bakers do that as well. So.
What else? Anybody else? Questions, comments?
And Renee, we'll share this as a PDF, send it off to people so that they have access to it. I got a couple of resources in there as well. And I know in the survey you have if people have other questions, Leo and I are happy to answer any other questions as needed.
Yeah, for sure. I was about to say that we'll have the presentation available up for you to have. We also have a survey that's going to come out as soon as we're done here. And one of the questions on there is just if you have any open questions for Shawn, she's more than willing to try and answer those. So, but we still have some time. So if you have some questions currently or you want to have any more discussion, go ahead. You've got her here live right now. You don't have to wait. Anthony, you trying to say something?
And while we're waiting for the questions, I'll just say that I know there's a lot of tariff fatigue. It's real. There was tariff fatigue in 2025. I think it did help that it was a little quieter fourth quarter. But if we do see this change in how tariffs are implemented and the different authorities, the tariff fatigue may be on your broker, having to figure out which tariff codes to use. Ideally, it may not be as problematic, at least on IEEPA tariffs, but we will continue to watch and know that everyone has their day job to do their job, and keeping up with the level of tariffs is not the happy part of a job, but we do realize that tariff fatigue will probably continue going forward, and that some things are as clear as mud, given Kerwin's many questions. There's just some things we don't know yet.
It has been interesting to hear you in the spring and then this summer and now how quickly things are changing.
Yes. And I when I first got on the call, I said to Renee and Kerwin, I'm sorry, but I'm still somewhat a Debbie Downer on this. There are some opportunities. We do see some possibilities, again, for some refunds. It's not going to be an easy process, but tariffs aren't going away. So, but the sky is not falling as we all start to normalize this going forward.
Well, we know not to punish the messenger.
Yeah. Thank you.
I do have a question. This is Terry Barge. I was a little confused. You went through the steel and aluminum. I think that was section 232. And is it how is that? I think some things come under. Who's determining what's I think because you said even the cans that are made out of aluminum could be hit with the tariffs and all that sort of stuff. So how is that determination? I heard we import from Canada to the US, and I heard that our exporter, I might have this wrong, but hopefully I have some of it right, but I heard our exporter kind of classified our conveyors were made of aluminum side frames. And even though we have an HS code for bakery equipment, and so there was there might have been a little bit of dispute between our exporter. How do you correct that? I mean, if there is a legitimate HS code, and who's making that ultimate call?
That's a good question. So we can share with BEMA to make sure that you have at your fingertips all the various documents, if you will, and Federal Register notices on what is covered in terms of scope. There is sometimes some, and a lot of times the scope is covered by tariff codes. Sometimes with these investigations, they will say that the language is what dictates, not just a tariff code. So if it meets the definition within the scope, that it could also be subject. But they have done a fairly good job of trying to outline which tariff codes are hit. Most bakery machinery and equipment is not targeted. I don't believe conveyor belts are targeted. That is one of the tariff codes that we looked at. And, you know, at this present time, it's to do that pushback potentially with you know, with your exporter on how they're doing that. But we are concerned that there will be an expansion. So we are going to be looking at how how these manufactured machinery is treated. Excuse me, but right now it should not be hit with Section 232 tariffs. And we can send you some of that scope information. We'll share that with Renee for distribution.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, you did a great job. I'm kind of, as I think Emily kind of said, things have changed. I'm kind of coming out of here a little bit more depressed than I was when I jumped on the call.
Yeah, and for me, it's the robotics. That is something I think that's going to be important. The Section 232 will continue to expand. Like I said, the fact that they have proposed evaporated milk in cans and spices in tins changes, again, makes it a slippery slope that everything that has steel and aluminum is potentially in scope. That's what makes me nervous. But right now, major machinery is not. And we should be able to help you with that. It depends on how aggressive the president wants to be to protect the steel and aluminum industry here in the United States. And does he feel that the Section 232 tariffs are working? He's got other industries he wants to protect as well.
Yeah, thanks.
Daniel has a question. Shawn, do you have time, or do you want us to?
No,
Go ahead,
please.
Daniel.
Yeah, hi, Daniel from Revent. Just a follow-up on that major bakery machinery. We import bakery ovens, and they sure get hit with a 50% because they're on that list, that subcode as far as we see it. So we got to declare every steel part or part containing steel in our ovens and pay tariffs on them. So
they're being hit with the Section 232 tariffs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. It's becoming a slippery slope, and we'll take, and again, we'll send some information to help delineate what is and what isn't, but I suspect we'll see more of this. And it's not easy. I know it's not easy to have to claim the country of origin and the content. It's an administrative burden.
Great. Any more questions? If not, we've come to time. Fantastic. Like I said, there'll be a survey that's coming out. There is an opportunity in there. If you have any more questions for Shawn, I'll share that information with her. Shawn, thank you so much for being here, and great presentation. And I was, happy to have some discussion here at the end, which is always nice. We'll talk to you soon, and hope everybody enjoyed the presentation.